Welcome to the Precision Teaching Podcast. I am Rick Cabina, along with my trusty co-host, Doug Kostowitz.
How's everybody doing out there?
We're doing good, Doug. Thanks for asking. There you have it.
Hey, I didn't expect an answer. All right.
Ask, you will get an answer. Well, Doug.
Wow.
As usual, we have a full show. Lots of interesting things to talk about. We have an excellent interview coming up. We retaped our interview with Steve Graf. That turned out very nicely. But let's start right away with our announcements. And I suppose at this point, the biggest announcement is that the Precision Teaching Conference is about a month away. We have that it's the 30th, and it goes the 29th, the 30th, and the 31st. So the countdown is on.
IPTC and Halloween goes together like Reese's Peanut Butter Cups.
It does. The registration should be open any day, but there is information on celebration.org, the website for the SCS, which you can look at who's presenting. You can get an idea of the money that it'll cost and so on. And hopefully you come and join us. We have an excellent conference agenda. We have good speakers that are coming, and we have chart share. And of course, we get to meet all the great people in the precision teaching community. Right away, that should sell tickets. Well, not tickets.
Well, and here I was waiting for the final plug of where it's at.
Oh, I didn't get to that. Yes, one of the biggest bonuses is that it is in, well, what could probably best be described as the closest thing to heaven on earth, State College, Pennsylvania. You're silent there, Doug.
I'm silent.
Did I shock you into silence with my characterization of State College?
Yeah,
okay.
I did.
Well, enough said then. Let's just keep going. Let's move into our science news. With our science news segment, we will pick something that we find interesting and talk about it. And this month, the science news is about peer review. And peer review is something that in all of science, peer review plays a role. When people disseminate their work, their scholarly work, they have to go through what's called peer review. For example, when Doug and I submit an article, you send it to a journal, and the journal has a review panel of qualified peers. That's what they would be called, and the peers will evaluate what you have submitted, and they will decide, is your contribution worthy of sharing with the professional audience? And whether your field is special education or geology or wherever, the peer review process is involved with dissemination of science.
Yes.
You agree with that characterization?
Oh, definitely. And this is an interesting article that we kind of looked at for today's podcast, and it just asked some questions with regards to the peer review process, and more importantly, the peers who are doing the reviewing and the quality of those reviews.
Right. The article says, for those of you who haven't had the honor of reviewing articles, it takes a lot of work. And this journal, I don't know, I guess it's a personal thing. This journal said the article was specific to a particular journal, and the journal was Annals of Emergency Medicine. And the people who review this are doctors and other people on the board. And they said that it takes upwards to 5 hours to do a review. I'm not sure how that works. Maybe sometimes I want to say that I might take a little longer than that, but I suppose sometimes I don't take a full 5 hours. Sometimes I could probably get it done in a little less than that. So I'm not sure how that works, but let's pretend it's 5 hours. That's depending on how many review boards you're on. For example, I think I'm on 5 journals right now, and if you get a lot of articles to review, that could be a lot of time and a lot of work for your participation in shaping science. You also are on review boards. I'm taking.
Oh yes, and they do take time, and it seems no matter how often you get a deadline, you're usually pressed for time with so many different things. But I would say 5 hours, at least for me, is kind of short. But for this case, it's about 5 hours, and I think that's by a product of medicine journal articles. I don't know if they're always as large as other articles because they're usually reporting treatments and specific situations, which advances how to, in this case, deal with emergency medicine.
Yeah, that's a good point. And now that you say that, I guess what I was thinking of is just the writing part. You have to read it, and oftentimes if you do a good review, if there's something in there that you don't know about, then that means you have to track down the original research, and you have to read that and figure out how that's assimilated. So regardless, it can take a while. But what this article said, and this is something that I thought was quite interesting, they have all of the people who submit reviews, they're rated. In all the journals that I've done review with, my performance for how well I reviewed the article has never been rated. But this journal did that. And that's interesting. I don't know if that's more common in different fields or that's specific just to this particular journal.
I, too, have never heard of a review being rated by an editorial board.
What they did with this study is if you have a review system, then you can research that. And that's exactly what they did. And the interesting finding is that for the majority of people who review articles, their performance declined across time. So in other words, even though they're doing these reviews and they have practice with reviews, the ratings that they're receiving decline over time for the majority of people.
Mm-hmm. And it did make the statement that it does take a while to notice that, and on average about 7 years to notice the difference. And for some of the, I guess, most market declines, 3 years. So it's not that, but that doesn't make logical sense that they're getting worse over time. You would think that they would be matching you up better with your area of expertise. You would know that research, and that you would be able to provide better feedback on reviews. So that was something that I took as pretty surprising.
Yeah, I agree with you. It is surprising. The only thing I could think of is if these people if you're an academic like us, within 7 years, you have a 10-year window, and maybe what happens is across time, you want to be on boards, you want to do a good job, and maybe after you have tenure, that changes a little bit. I'm just guessing. I don't know that that's what really goes into it or what accounts for it.
And maybe now that I'm thinking about it, as you're spending more time in a field, if you're not staying up on the most current research, you're falling back on what you knew 7-8 years ago.
Sure.
By then, you may be a little behind the time. So, and it takes work to stay current, even within a very finite field.
Yeah. So this research doesn't say exactly why this is happening. And they do say in this research that you can't generalize this one to everyone, obviously. But nevertheless, it's intriguing because when you think about what do we know about the world, and what we know about the world is governed by the peer review process. So the peer review process is very significant in all sciences, and if you have something that can't get by a peer review, you have to ask, okay, why? Is this information, was it poorly constructed? Were there flaws in it? And so on and so forth. Looking at this study, then, again, it's important to look at this process. So I thought this was an interesting read.
I'll ask you this. I'll ask you a question.
Okay.
Can you imagine a better process than the peer review process?
Yeah. People debate that, and to be honest with you, the peer review, this is what always gets at me when people argue about peer review. They say it's not perfect. Of course it's not perfect. But what would be the better alternative?
Right. And that's, I guess,
know.
I was asking more of an open question, but yeah, I don't know of anything better than that. And you have to take the bad with the good with regards to the peer review process.
Exactly. Well, that was a nice article. Why don't we move on? We have an email question. And this email question comes from Scott G. And Scott asks, can you tell me where I can study PT in psychology? And Doug and I are special ed guys. And I was thinking about this, and I know of a few professors in psychology, but I don't know really of any well, of course, I take that back. The one program that I did think of was Chicago School, but that's in school psychology. Mm-hmm. There you could learn about precision teaching. But I guess when I started thinking about a psychology program, for example, like at Penn State or Ohio State, I couldn't think of any other programs out there. Again, there could be some programs with a professor, but
right.
What did you think of anything for PT in psychology?
In psychology, I have not. Now I've run into people. Both Rick and I are board certified behavior analysts, and part of my career building up to this, career as a professor, I worked as a behavior analyst in foster care, and I ran into some psychologists who had picked up the use of the chart, standard acceleration chart, but I think they didn't necessarily receive that from a program. I think that it was an older gentleman, and I think it was closer into the 70s, and it was probably something from the teacher his advisor who passed it on to him during his doctoral work. And so he was considered a psychologist, but he used the chart, he used the methods of precision teaching. So I think your best bet is to try to determine certain professors who can tailor PT within a larger department. I couldn't think of anything else.
Yeah. No, that's good. Hank Pennypacker comes to mind. Of course, he's retired. He was in a psychology department. I don't know if there's anyone else that's currently at Florida that's doing the chart. There's no one that I can think of. Jesus Rosales Riz is at North Texas, and they offer a master's program in behavior analysis, which is under psychology. I don't know what degree he was looking to pursue, but I don't know any PT programs in psychology other than the Chicago School that jumps to mind. Boy, I hope I'm not missing something.
Yeah, I know. Now, what about undergraduate? I know you mentioned some graduate, but anything jumps to mind if I say undergraduate?
In psychology?
Yeah.
Nothing. Well, that's the same thing, because whatever professor I would know of working somewhere would obviously be doing. I suppose there could be people out there that just don't know who are doing things. When I think about who are my connections, well, I meet people through submitting articles to the journal, through coming to the conference, through reading as much as I can, and if people aren't showing up in those media, then I wouldn't know who they are. For example, there could be someone who's at a particular university that's doing things but isn't publishing, and they're not coming to our conferences, and I just don't know who they are. But we have a small community, and we tend to know people pretty quick and see who's doing what.
That might be a good question for the listserv.
Yeah, that is a good point. We have over 250 people on the SC listserv, and that is free to join. And that's a good suggestion. Join the listserv and maybe ask that question there. Well, Scott, I hope that was a useful answer for you. If you want to come and study special education, well, I know two good professors well, actually, I should say there's more than two of us. I was thinking about you and I. I can now think about a few other people, so I probably shouldn't insult anyone else.
No,
but there are some good professors in Pennsylvania and elsewhere if you want to study for special education.
All right.
Let's move on. We have an article to review, and this article is by Claire McDowell and Michael Keenan. This was published in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis in 2001, and this study is about developing fluency and endurance in a student who has attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And this is it's nice to see behavioral fluency studies that are published outside of the Journal of Precision Teaching. And this one was a report, and it was published in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, which is a very, what's the word I'm looking for, prestigious journal. Yeah. So it was nice to see that this work was recognized and it was published. This study looked at this was with one student who, as I mentioned, had ADHD. And what they looked at two behaviors. They looked at the frequency of proper letter sounds that were said correctly on these flashcards. And the other thing they looked at was time on task. They did have a frequency aim, and they wanted the student to get to the aim of 60 to 80 sounds per minute, and they had a single case reversal design. That's another nice thing too I like about this article, is they're showing, hey, look, we can put an experimental design on this and produce some interesting findings. To make a long story short, what they did is they had baseline, and then they had a practice procedure that was taking place. It was before the student was, they were doing the one timing. And,
right.
Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, yeah, there was the 10-minute baseline, and then it was, instead of just 10 minutes they provided error correction, verbal prompts, feedback, and any that were missed required, they kept practicing until they didn't have an error, and then they would test for 1 minute. And the Student was able to complete as many timings as he liked, but he had to do at least 2.
Right. And what did they find? They did a reversal, and what they found was during the baseline periods, the student made errors and didn't respond as accurately or as fluently, because they look at accuracy and they look at the speed, as when the intervention was going. They also looked at time on task, and the way they, let's see, how did they measure the time on task? I think they said
percent of intervals.
Yeah, but I'm talking about exactly how they did it. If the student was looking at the work, he was on task, and what is it? Anything else that they were doing was off task.
Time spent on task was defined as time spent engaged in sounding letters.
Yeah. So that would be looking right at the materials. If you're not looking at the materials or you're doing something else, then that would be considered time off task. What they found with the results, when the intervention was on, the time on task was at 100%, right? And the times that it wasn't, it fluctuated between 40, 50, 60%, somewhere around that range.
But not all baselines. The one following an extended time of, it looks about 25 sessions, where the student was slightly below aim, maybe 5 of those sessions, but was in the range of 60 to 80. They went back to baseline, and the student maintained 100% time on task and maintained corrects above the aim line. So when they went to maintenance with the last reversal. I
see. You're talking about the very last phase?
Yeah, the final reversal. The student was able to display what Binder would call endurance, or what he refers to as endurance, because they didn't show distraction. They were at 100% on task, and the final part, they were above the aim, and they made a total of 2 errors across 4 sessions.
The one thing I didn't get with this graph is if you look at where the 1 error is and where the 0 error is, there's X's in between the 1 and the 0. I wasn't sure what that was.
I don't think that, well, of course, on a standard acceleration chart, there is no 0. It's below the 1 line. So my guess is that those are zeros, but to make a graph for Java, it had to go to 0. But it was created, I think, in some other format, so placed it at that level, which that's what happens, because there is not a standard acceleration chart in the article. It is just simply a logarithmically scaled.
Yeah, this is a semi-logarithmic chart. Yeah, you're probably right there. That's probably what happened. I know on some of the Excel templates, if you put a 0 in, it comes at the 0.5 line, which is right below the counting time bar for 1 minute, and that might be what's going on here.
Yeah.
But the intervention worked, and if you have a theory about something and you say, well, I think something, I'm not saying they set out to prove endurance, but what we know, in other words, when we have a theory about something, for example, reinforcement, we can say we have a theory about reinforcement, that if we have a behavior that's followed by a reinforcing consequence, the future likelihood of that behavior will occur again in the future. And when we do other experiments, if they keep supporting that theory. And of course, what happened with reinforcement is there's so much support there that we can now call it a principle or a law. That's how you establish faith in science, and you can look at things that are reproducible. And this is one study, and it's a published in JABA, and I think it's a nice, quick way to show some research that was done to help the student. And of course, the outcome was nice, and the student, as you pointed out, continued over, even though they took the intervention away, the student still did very well.
I did have some questions, though.
Yeah.
And maybe I missed it. I would like to, and to be fair, this is a report in JABA which follows a very specific format. You're only allowed to include so many things within a report and have it still be a report. Some questions I have are, they said that the student can have as many timings as he wants. Well, it would be nice to first see those timings, which I'm sure if it was on a full standard acceleration chart, it would be, you'd be able to see the timings. But I also don't know which timing was plotted, if it was the best, if it was the last. And I know sometimes, but it just remaining consistent. And
you know what they probably did, Doug, though? This is session, so I wonder if they plotted multiple timings.
Well, you could time as many, the way I read this is you could have as many timings as you want after you're done with the practice.
Mm-hmm.
So you could time but they do mention here in the results that the student, the frequency of incorrect responses slightly after a 2-week vacation. So there was a hole in the middle, right there where the errors picked up. Didn't change the corrects, but the errors picked up. And it almost looks like corrects decelerated back down to 60. So.
Wait, 60? Are you on time on task?
No, I'm up on the corrects. You see where it's at 80, and then so it remained at 80. I guess that where
I see. Yeah,
the errors increased, and then it decelerated back down to actually below the aim line, before settling at right about 60, 65. And then it stayed the same in maintenance. So it would, obviously having the full standard acceleration chart would answer a lot of those questions, because you'd have all the conventions, you'd be able to see the space in between. Without reading and just looking at the graph, you wouldn't know that there's a 2-week between session 30 and 31, a 2-week break.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't know if these two, maybe they tried to put their data on a standard acceleration chart. You never know those answers unless you ask the people directly.
Right.
If they did that. But these two certainly have a nice publication history in the Journal of Precision Teaching, and I have seen them publish standard acceleration charts before.
Oh.
So I wonder what the case is with this.
It might have been a product of it being a brief report.
That could be too.
So
that's the thing. If you're submitting a brief report and you try to stick a standard acceleration chart and you're submitting it to JABA, how many people in the brief report are going to be able to understand that? And you have a limited amount of space you can write, and they actually tell you this is how much space you're allotted. And if you can't communicate your graphic to people who don't understand it, then that could be a problem right there.
Right.
Yeah. Any other thoughts or comments about this article, Doug?
No, I thought it was nice to see, as you mentioned, behavioral fluency appearing in some other journals, and especially in Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis. So.
Okay, that is our article review. Let's move on to our interview. I would like to re-welcome Dr. Stephen Graf to the Precision Teaching Podcast. Welcome, Dr. Graf.
Thanks, Rick.
I say re-welcome because one of the first podcast interviews I did was with Steve, and due to technical problems on my end, I botched the interview in terms of how well it could be heard and how well it turned out. So Steve has generously agreed to speak with us again, and very happy. And again, thank you for your time, Steve.
Sure.
I always like to start off the podcast by asking people, how did you get involved in precision teaching?
Well, I was a graduate student at Ohio State, and my area was verbal behavior, and I was taking a course in, I think it was behavior modification as an elective, and the instructor gave us a heads up on a off-campus visitor who was going to be giving 3 lectures at the Med Center at Ohio State. And he said this was a fellow we shouldn't miss. So I went, and it was Ogden Lindsley. This was in spring of 1967. And after hearing the first lecture, I went back for the second 2, and I was convinced Ogden knew what he was talking about, was headed in the right direction, and I was hooked. So my interest in precision teaching sort of grew out of a commitment to Ogden and the sorts of things that he was doing.
What was he talking about? Do you remember what he talked about in those lectures? Because that had to have been right at the beginning of PT.
Yeah. One of the things he was saying was that he was offering a $500 reward for any verified case of symptom substitution. And he was also saying something about how psychiatrists, if they did such and so, should be sued, and I don't remember exactly what the issue was, but he was also using or talking about the is-does equation at that time, or is-did as it later became.
Mm-hmm. And you got your degree at Ohio State in psychology. Was your dissertation precision teaching related?
No. The only operant conditioner at Ohio State at the time was Reed Lawson, and unfortunately the semester or the quarter that I took the course, he took ill and died during the course, and during the rest of my time at Ohio State, they never replaced him. So there were no operant conditioners within the psychology department. So I finished my degree in verbal learning and memory.
Oh, okay.
And then after getting the degree, sort of committed myself to precision teaching once I got out.
And much of your time as a professor at Youngstown State, you have been teaching a course on precision teaching. I know that you being my chart parent, I took that course, but have you taught that course your whole tenure at Youngstown State, or did that happen sometime later?
Well, there was, let's see, I'm remembering the course that you were in, and that course was only offered once, and so you were in the only class that ever got it.
Ah.
But at about that time, I had decided that it didn't need to be a course in precision teaching. That what I could do was just implement all sorts of precision teaching strategies and standard acceleration charting in any course I was teaching. And so that's what happened. And so since that time, and everything was just permeated with precision teaching stuff, precision teaching methods, and standard acceleration charting.
Okay. So I know that myself, I came through Youngstown State. John Eshelman was also a Youngstown State undergrad. And Guy Bedient was also, but I thought there was someone else, or maybe two. Well, of course, Sean Datchick came through Youngstown State, but I thought there was someone before us that I'm forgetting. Is that right? Because I actually was going through this old videotape that you sent, and I took a picture with John Eshelman and some other guy who I didn't know, and he said, "Hey, this is all people from Youngstown State." Does that ring a bell? Do you know who I'm talking about? Because I was trying to think about all the people that I know that went out and did things, and at another level with precision teaching.
Yeah. What do you know? What year you're referring to in the picture?
It would have been, let's see, I think DC or Atlanta. Maybe Atlanta.
Oh, okay. Yeah, there was another YSU student who became a psychology department head at, I think it was Florida International, but he was, prior to any precision teaching instruction on my part, so he never really, and he was at the Association for Behavior Analysis and in that, but he was never a bona fide precision teacher.
Oh, I see. Interesting. And I guess those lessons, no, I don't just guess, I know those lessons that I learned, so many of them early on, I look back, I still have my notebook from class, and it's interesting that looking back and going over those topics that we are covering, I still don't know how much farther we've gotten as a field in embracing some of those topics and using them in our everyday practice. So I'm wondering what you share, if you have similar feelings to that.
Yes, I think that's a valid point. When you look at what, particularly from a big perspective of what standard acceleration charting could mean to psychology, you really can see that we haven't, the field hasn't made a whole lot of progress in last 20 years from a measurement and graphic perspective. And I think even within precision teaching, there hasn't been a lot of impetus on pushing forward some of the larger issues, such as using standard acceleration charting and all types of measurement. I think the biggest gains have been in just specific topic areas where it's just absolutely essential that you do measurement and do the best measurement possible that predicts best. So standard acceleration charting and precision teaching have sort of garnered a niche in those areas.
What are those big picture things that you think of? You mentioned, well, maybe elaborate more on what you meant with the precision teaching and the charting aspect.
Well, in charting, for example, there are so many data opportunities with the internet nowadays that the types of information that used to take days or weeks in gathering are really available at one's fingertips. So and an example would be professional sports. With a yearly per year chart, you can look at or a yearly per minute chart. So you could look at an individual's performance in, let's say, the NBA from year to year. They have all the data for the number of minutes played and then each of the 10 to 20 statistics that they keep. So you could chart an individual's entire career or a team's career, a team's history. And really, I think an individual could make a living as an agent simply by availing themselves of the available data and the standard acceleration charting method. Because you can make predictions of where the person's going and look at their present salary and all sorts of salary data, which is probably the least available, but all of the statistical data, you can really make a case for how individuals are progressing or how they are declining. And so if you're in management, you could decide when to get rid of a player.
That's intriguing when you start thinking about it like that. Well, let me ask a couple other questions that I've been thinking of based on what you said. Some people are arguing, this is a timely topic, about what is standard about the standard acceleration chart, and I've seen some people try to argue that when you go to a web-based or a computer-based template that it can't be standard. What do you think about that? My thought that the standard acceleration chart, that what made it standard was the doubling, and that was the big thing, the 34-degree angle, but I think
right, and the corner-to-corner doubling and the 34-degree angle, with those parameters, you can do a pretty decent job of estimating it on a computer screen. Now, different programs have different capabilities. So there, when we were using StatView, it allowed you to fix the size of the grid. And that was extremely handy for a standard acceleration chart. In a format such as Microsoft Excel, that is not exactly doable, at least under current versions. So it makes it a little tougher and harder to really get it perfect, but you can do a pretty good approximation with a lot of trial and error. So I think as far as what's possible, it would be possible on a computer screen to have, I think, a standard chart. It's just that the standardization within the computer industry is sort of like a lot of standardization is not really standard across the board.
Well, there are a number of people out there, you being one of them. I think Stu Harder and Scott Bourne and Owen White, they have their template, but then before them, I know that Chuck Merbitz for quite some time has been doing stuff on the web, and of course Ian Spence has been charting for quite some time, and I'm probably missing some people out there.
Well, Ben Merbitz, but he's Chuck's son, so it sort of counts
as
the same.
So there's a lot of people that are out there And it seems to me that with where technology is going and all the advantages that you just talked about, looking at that as a viable venue for precision teaching in the future of standard acceleration charting is a area that we should embrace and we should explore. Would you agree with that? Or,
yeah.
Okay.
I think probably the biggest challenge is that the software programs, and particularly the software programs that sell a lot, like Microsoft Excel, tend to try to keep reinventing themselves or coming out with different versions because they want people to buy upgrades.
Right.
And so they are constantly making small changes, but those small changes may have some repercussions if you're doing some type of specialty work, and standard acceleration chart templates are certainly an example of that. So when you eliminate macros, for example, or do something fairly major that is embedded in some templates that have been set up, then you really have the software industry is having an effect on how well we can carry forward what we're trying to do.
I totally agree with what you're saying. I have a number of Macs in my house, but I still have one that has System 9. It was the last, I don't know how old, this computer has to be probably from 2000, maybe 2001. It's a G4, and the only reason why I hang on to it is just so I can still do stat view. Because if I have an article that I want to publish and I want to put the best possible computer chart forward, then I use StatView. And when I publish, I'm not talking about the Journal of Precision Teaching, because it's easy enough just to have a chart and have it scanned in if I want to do that. But other places wouldn't accept that, or at least it's harder in my experience to have them accept it. So I use the StatView template, and that seems to be more accepted.
Mm-hmm.
At least in my experience it has.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, because I think that certainly is one way to solve the problem, and that is have a dedicated computer which is based on the programs that you need and that you know work, so that you've got them for as long as you need them, and nothing that comes along later is going to change your ability to use that, unless the computer wears out.
Which can happen, but not normally with the Mac. That's more with the PC. I'm sorry, all my PC friends out there. I can't help but take jabs with the PC. I actually started with the Mac when I came to YSU, and back in, what was it, 1986, I remember we had a lab. It was that was Kilcawley. Is that Kilcawley, where that student center is? Is that right? I'm not
right.
remember if that was. Yeah, so you would go up there, and you would give them your ID, and you could log in time. And I think they had Mac Classics back then. It's amazing to think about where we came from, the Mac Classics in Kilcawley, to where we are now.
Mm-hmm.
Now you have this unbelievable technology. Well, that leads me to another question. What do you plan on? I know you have the yearly chart, or how would you describe is that the yearly per year?
The 1 year chart.
The 1 year chart. That's the word I was looking for. What else do you plan on, or do you plan on releasing other charts?
Well, we are working on a timings chart. Mm-hmm. That has various options for different timings that will create an on-screen view of what your timing time is and within various parameters, but it's also a goal of ours to make what we're currently, as a working term, calling a accumulator, so that those timings charts would produce a daily dot, so that every day the timings chart becomes a point on a daily chart, and then each week the timings chart becomes a weekly point, and then each month the timings chart becomes a monthly point, so that those all would be interfaced, and you'd have and the user wouldn't have to go sifting through all of the data, but that would be done for them. And the goal, of course, is to have the other components done by the program as well. So not only plotting the data on a standard acceleration chart of various standard timings charts, but also doing accelerations, bounce, jump and turn tests, and outliers.
What that will be set up as just one template?
Probably two, at least two. So if possible, we would run the accumulator with the timings chart, but we're not at the stage yet where that's a reality. So at this point, it's two different templates.
Will it be 140 days?
Well, we're working really within both of those worlds. So we're pushing forward with the 1 year chart, but the timings chart, because it's used right now exclusively with the daily per minute chart, 140-day chart, then we're setting up initially the timings chart will be used with that. But there's no reason it couldn't be used with the 1 year chart as well.
Now, when you say timings chart, does that mean it will look like the timings chart that was developed by BRCO?
Well, the timings chart that was developed by BRCO is not a true standard acceleration chart because it doesn't have 6 cycles. So the timings charts that we're talking about would be true standard acceleration charts because they would be 6 cycle. All of them would be 6 cycle. They would all have 20 acceleration periods, be corner to corner doubling with the appropriate ×2 acceleration angle and so forth.
Is that okay? Are those the parameters for if someone says this is a true standard acceleration chart, this is not? 6 cycles, the ×2, and the 20 weekly periods.
That does it pretty well, as long as you're talking count per time up the left and a time unit across the bottom. The time units across the bottom fall into different categories, and there could be some that wouldn't be recognized as standards right now, but if you take those additional factors into consideration, then I think you've pretty well got a fix on a standard acceleration chart.
This will be a nice segue into my next question, because we're talking about, with your timings chart in practice, I think it's safe to say in most of the people in our field, you are probably one of the top people that I know of who has just taken so much data on practice and what effects it has and what it looks like on a standard acceleration chart. My question to you is, what would be some big discoveries you've learned with effective practice in how to promote exceptional performance?
Let's see. Well, one of the counterintuitive things, I think, that one learns from monitoring practice, and by that I mean just, well, let's look at basketball as an example. My motto is count every shot. So I try to, on a basketball court, count my warm-ups, my form type shots, as practice, my game shots, and then my cool down shots, and both indoors and outdoors, and the categories are 3-point shots, 2-point shots, and free throws. So one of the things that I've discovered from that type of monitoring that's counterintuitive is that they're really, the notion of a bad day is really inappropriate, because bad days don't usually actually happen. It's just bad minutes, and it's more on the framework of minutes than it is days if you monitor practice. As an example, this past week, I will typically shoot 100 3-point shots before our morning games, and my average is about 62% or 62 makes and 38 misses, and usually about 16 minutes it takes me with just rebounding for myself. This particular day, I had 50 makes and 50 misses. So that's really one of my poorest performances of the year 2009. Okay, so we play a game, and that lasts an hour or so. And during the game, I made 9 3-pointers and I missed 22. So again, not a particularly good day at all. In fact, one I'd tend to want to forget. Then in my cool down, I made 83 3-pointers and missed 17, which was my best of the year. So the point that I'm making is that you can be having a horrible day, and it really doesn't mean anything. And I think too many people have the wrong notion that a performance is going to maintain for the rest of the day the way it starts out. Now, there are some pretty sage aphorisms. Like I think Larry Bird once said, if you're hot, keep shooting. And this is pertaining to basketball, of course. If you're hot, keep shooting. If you're not hot, keep shooting until you get hot. And from my perspective, that really bears out.
Mm-hmm. Your comments are intriguing, because right now I am reading a book in fact, there's a number of books that I'm reading that all have to deal with practice and exceptional performance. But the book I'm reading now is called The Talent Code. And what the author did is he goes to these places, they call them chicken wire Harvards, meaning these are places that have very little money but produce incredible performers. So I wish I could remember what the names are. I'm sure I'll remember later. There's this place in Russia where they've produced 20 world champion tennis players, but yet they hardly have any money. There's this, they talk about, what was his name? Charlie Chaplin's brother, his name was Link, and he created these, he basically was the guy who created simulators for flight training. And there is this other place, too, that is in Brazil, and they show how And I'm killing myself for not remembering these names, but there's a form of, it's not soccer, but it's like soccer that they play. And at any rate, he's going over to all these places where they produce this exceptional performance, and what he finds is a couple things. He's talking about this thing called deep practice, and what deep practice involves is it involves, number one, having focused practice in times that you would otherwise not be able to have focused practice. And whenever I read this, I think about precision teaching and how does this work how does this all work? So he gives this example of this one little girl who he says, okay, she gets a month's worth of practice in 6 minutes. And something that's emerging, which I really find fascinating, and I wanted to bounce this off you, is some things that people do when they practice is they always try to practice to the edge of how good they are, but they make mistakes, and then they learn from these mistakes. And talking, for example, the link, what do they call it? They call it the link something based off that guy who created it, but you can make lots of mistakes in the link trainer, that's what they call it, even though you can't make those mistakes when you're flying a plane. You make a mistake in the plane and you end up crashing the plane and dying. But you can make these mistakes in the link trainer. And with musical instruments, they highlight this young girl who keeps making these mistakes, but as she makes them, she quickly learns from those mistakes. And the same thing with soccer. And I just found this really intriguing because, number one, if you look beyond precision teaching, people don't even report errors in a lot of time. For example, in curriculum-based measurement in CBM, you very often don't find a lot of the only performance are correct performances, and the errors are not charted at all. But thinking back on our field, how are learning opportunities or errors or whatever you want to call them, how are they treated? And have you learned anything about when you have a learning opportunity, what does that tell you? Is there anything special you do with that? I'm just fascinated by this book I'm reading and thinking about, is there something that some people know about in our field, or it just really has me thinking about where we might go with how do we treat errors and how do we use that with our learning.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing that I think the standard acceleration chart helps with in that regard is the notion of bounce. Mm-hmm. So the correct performance has a bounce, but the bounce for errors is independent. And as you watch over practice, you kind of expect that both of those bounces, while independent, as the person becomes more proficient and nears some type of fluency, that the bounce becomes less and less. So monitoring the bounce is really quite helpful in that respect. It also kind of points up the importance of outliers as well. So when you do have an extraordinarily good or bad day, you pay attention to it rather than just neglect it. And when you have been monitoring bounce, you really know just how exceptional that day was, because it's calculatable from the distance away from the acceleration.
What you're saying is all true. And if you think about what is our best practice procedure, it would be monitoring a behavior, a time performance, doing more in that, trying to do as many opportunities you can within that time practice, and then maybe coaching or giving feedback for errors. Would that be safe to say?
I think so. I think as a general statement, there are going to be, because we're talking about the whole realm of behavior, there are going to be instances where some types of practice are more doable than in other situations. But if you're trying to make just some general points, then I think you're on the correct path.
When I read more of this book, I will let you know and others if there are things in there that really are applicable to what we do. But I wonder, though, because we are in a position to produce such exceptional performance already, what else can we learn? And I suppose if you're talking about shaping up a behavior, you look at two things. One, you look at the performance that is being done correctly, and how do you get that to happen as quickly as you can. But the other is when you're doing things incorrectly, what effect is that? So if it is independent, is there a way to somehow affect the corrects with that type of performance? That seems to be part of what I'm getting from this book, but I haven't finished reading it, but it's making me think a lot about practice and the outcome of practice.
Yeah, that is interesting. Well, in some situations, an error is pretty straightforward, and it always results from the same sort of behavior. In other performances, the errors are just is just a term that really covers a lot of other behaviors or a combination of behaviors. So again, to use basketball shooting as an example, the fellow who has looked at basketball shooting most scientifically believes that there are 22 different things that must be done in a shot, and each one of those can go wrong, and so that produces 22 possible errors. And so when you miss a shot, sometimes you make one type of error, sometimes you make another type of error. Even when you make a shot, sometimes you made several of those errors, which then kind of compounds the problem because you were, in a sense, rewarded for, even though you didn't have an errorless performance. So it's all quite, I think, at a level of complexity that we don't often think about with the degree of, with the smaller behaviors that are involved in a lot of athletic skills. I'm thinking swinging a golf club, shooting a basketball, hitting a baseball, so forth.
That is a great point. I thought, too, along those lines when I was thinking about different performances, and if these are chain performances where you could probably put a number on lots of these, which if you do a golf swing, how many behaviors are there that have to come together in that chain to perform or to produce the particular outcome that you want? And that sounds to me like the person you're talking about has already done that in terms of basketball.
Well, he never had a monitoring system such as a standard acceleration chart to help him along. He was good enough that he is able to reach pretty fantastic levels of performance even without monitoring, because he just knew what the errors were and he was able to systematically eliminate them.
For our listening audience, who are we talking about? I don't know if you mentioned his name.
think his name is Ed Palubinskas.
Okay.
Originally an Australian, born in Australia. He was on the Australian Olympic basketball team for several Olympics, and then became sort of a personal coach here in the United States for some NBA players.
I am always intrigued by people who can break things down in sports and produce replicable results, because what I find is that process is no different with academics and cognitive behavior, if you will. You take something, you break it down, and you look at the process can work very similarly.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's another beauty of the standard acceleration chart. You can see the similarity between academic and athletic performance so easily in a context of the same framework.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've been retired for, what is it now? Is it 4 years?
Right.
Okay. What are you doing with yourself?
Well, I'm still teaching the extraterrestrial course. When I retired, I thought that I wanted to look around and see what's the most important problem facing the world today, and then refocus my attention on trying to make some kind of difference in that particular category. So the extraterrestrial presence was what I determined was the most important thing, because it's tied into alternative energy. And so I've been, along with my brother-in-law, teaching a course still at YSU in extraterrestrials, meditation, and free energy. And after a kind of a slow start, it's picked up and gotten pretty good reception over the last several semesters. So I'm enjoying that challenge.
You're teaching that this semester?
Yes.
How many students did you get?
Let's see, I think there were 22 at the peak, and you always lose some after the semester starts.
Very good. Well, we're towards the end of our interview. Is there anything that I should have asked you, or anything else you'd like to talk about?
I guess one of the other challenges that I'm facing is putting golf on the standard acceleration chart. I've determined that golf is one of the more ideal sports, because as long as you have the tools, then you can practice by yourself without anybody else, and you can actually play by yourself without anybody else, and so you can develop skills whenever you feel like working on them. And to me, that's one of the characteristics of an ideal sport. Basketball comes close because you can practice anytime you want, but you can't really play unless you've got other people involved.
Well, you have imaginary friends.
Yeah, I have to say I've done that. So I've had imaginary players and keep score for all of them. But that's in a realistic sense, that's the way I rate sports, is to how much can you do on your own without need of involving others.
And what have you discovered with golf?
Well, I'm still in the formative stages. I've noticed that my ratio of shots to par has decelerated by 1.11 per 3 weeks. So that is of interest to me, because I wasn't sure if at my age at my advanced age if I could get any better if I started something and just tried practicing it.
I'll tell you my personal story. The very first class that I took with you was the precision teaching class, and I applied that to my golf game back then, and that actually set me on my way to being where I am today. I was so interested in it, and I did so much with it, and I was so, every time I would try to explain it or tell people what I'm doing, everyone thought I was just crazy. But as much, even though that was true, I did see some results, and I was thinking, wow, if I could do this for golf, what else could I do it for? And of course, talking to you, then I went to Ohio State, and pretty much the rest was history after that. So it's interesting you're doing golf now, because that's sort of where I started off with precision teaching.
Yep, and I remember that. You would line up a number of balls so you didn't have to lean over and put another ball on a tee. You just hit,
Yes.
hit. Get a lot off in a minute.
I did learn some things that I probably shouldn't have been doing. When I would golf, I would time how long it would take me to golf, and then I would chart all of my fairway shots, all of my chip shots, and I never really golfed enough, or I never really, maybe it was because I was always with different people and different golf courses, where I never really could make sense of that data.
Uh-huh.
I don't know if that
was... I think part of the problem with golf is most people don't put in nearly enough practice. They just play. Yes. And they hope to improve by playing.
Yeah, that's so true.
That's what I found is that you really got to practice to get any better. I remember when I was at Ohio State in 1968, I played 134 rounds at the Scarlet and Gray over the course of a summer. And I didn't get any better over those 134 rounds. So I essentially gave up golf for about 40 years. But when I started to reapply, the first thing I decided was I got to have my own course. So I made my backyard into a golf course. I found what's called an almost golf ball, which is 1/3 the weight of a regular ball, which has the same flight characteristics, but is much lighter and doesn't go as far. And then I found a simulated green that I could put in, and so essentially I just made an 18-hole course in my yard, and I have a scorecard and everything, and can play, but also can practice any type of shot that I need to work on.
Have you, or do you occasionally go beyond your course and see how that works on another course?
No, there's some temptation to do that, but so far I've restrained myself because the investment I made in my own course, I said this is golf, but it's my own type of golf. So I'm really interested in improving what I can do within this little world, and I'm not all that interested in going out and paying $75 a round and taking 4 hours driving somewhere to play. So this makes it really nice. I go out anytime and play as much as I want and practice as much as I want. And it's now just a matter of reducing the costs of what I put out.
So the next time I'm back in the Youngstown area, I can have an 18-hole golf on your course?
That's right, at the Bigfoot Country Club.
All right. Oh, I like the name. So as you go around, do you have like impressions of feet?
That's a good idea. I'll see if I can implement that. A different foot imprint at each tee.
Well, Steve, I can't thank you enough for spending your time with us here. As usual, the time just goes too fast, but I always learn something new when I speak to you. And I know I say that, and thank you for all of my audience, because you're such a Great person and such a great fountain of information. So thank you for your time.
Well, thank you, Rick, and thanks for everything you do. You're certainly a sterling achiever in the precision teaching and standard acceleration charting world, and we all thank you for it.
Well, thank you. That, as usual, was a very insightful podcast interview. That's what you were thinking, right, Doug?
All the time. All the time. Sorry, I got a little bit of a cold. So if you heard me sniffling, it was because I got a cold.
And everybody is getting sick. In my daughter's school, there were like 100 kids that were out. And at Penn State, we've had reports of lots of students being out. And with the swine flu and just the flu season, now they have all of these precautions for everybody to stay home. And what's the word they use? To
self-isolate.
Yeah, self-isolate yourself. So I hope that you don't need to self-isolate yourself and you feel better.
No.
Like everybody's getting sick now.
No, there's nothing you can do for a cold.
Yeah.
That's it.
But what's the old wives, not the wives' tale, but...
Feed a cold, starve a flu, I think.
Yeah, feed a cold, starve a flu. So get eating, Doug.
I haven't been hungry, so you know I'm sick, man.
Yeah.
All right.
Wait a second. There's something I want to do here. Okay. For Doug Kostowitz, I am Rick Cabina, and I thank you for listening to the Precision Teaching Podcast.